From Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
The lawsuit is expected today. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power, as Fed Governor Lisa Cook's lawyer is expected to file the lawsuit against the White House as President Trump attempts to have her fired. We'll get a live report from the White House on this as well. The new 50% tariff being put up against India today. I'm going to bring you an important conversation later this hour with Joe Lavorgna, the former economic advisor to President Trump, now counselor to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, making his way over from the Treasury right now. He'll be with us in a few moments as we start, as ever, on Wall Street. Nvidia earnings are just hours away, and we update the markets now with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Charlie, what do you have?
Well, thank you very much, Joe Mathieu. Indeed, Nvidia shares up now, little changed, higher in the green, up by about 0.1%, ahead of a closely watched earnings report after the close of trading today. Yes, complete coverage as the number drops on Bloomberg television and radio. Nvidia right now up by just under 0.1%. S&P up 10. That is a gain of 0.2%. Likewise for the Dow, up 0.2%. Nasdaq up by 0.1%. The Mag 7 index, of which Nvidia is a part, trading lower by 0.1%. 10-year 4.24%. Spot gold up $1.93 the ounce, up under 0.1%, 33.95. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, 63.88 a barrel. Bottom line here, Nvidia, the big event coming up after the close of trading, shares up now by just under 0.1%. From Washington, word that the U.S. has approved the latest COVID shots with new limits on who gets them. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Mathieu.
Okay, Charlie, thanks. We'll get more from Charlie Pellet in about 20 minutes as we watch Wall Street on the way to Nvidia earnings and a couple of other stocks in the air as well. CrowdStrike is also reporting after the bell. This could be a really important after-hour session as we try to figure the future of high tech, at least in the near term, on Wall Street. So stay with us, and we'll have much more, of course, on Nvidia in the late edition of Balance of Power. On the way, our conversation with Joe Lavorgna, counselor to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, as President Trump prepares to follow through with his plans to have Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook fired. Not so fast, she says, of course, planning now to file suit to keep her job. Her lawyer, Abby Lowell, suggesting that that could come as soon as today. We want to bring you to the White House here for the latest from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. We did hear from Kevin Hassett this morning. He was speaking outside the White House, economic advisor to the president, about this effort to fire the Fed governor, with questions about whether the president, in fact, has the authority to carry this out. Here's what he said.
The president absolutely has authority to fire a Fed governor for cause. And I think the accusations are serious. And I look forward to seeing the outcome. If I were her in her circumstance, I would take leave right now. I think it's the honorable thing to do.
Would take leave right now, he says, even though she has actually not been charged with anything. There is a criminal investigation at the Department of Justice underway that had been referred from the administration. But let's get the latest now from the White House. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is on the North Lawn. What do we know about this lawsuit, Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, as you outlined there, we've heard so far from at least two administration officials today. One was the NEC director, Kevin Hassett. The second was the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who in an interview earlier this morning urged the Federal Reserve to conduct an internal review that would include these allegations of mortgage occupancy fraud before an external review, something that the Treasury Secretary has actually long called for when it comes to the central bank. All of this to say that at this point, the messaging out of the White House when it comes to this legal challenge is that they're not going to back down. In fact, you had President Trump yesterday saying that he is prepared to fight this in court. And when pressed by our very own Anne-Marie Hordern, he did say that he would abide by any court decision, because at this point we are waiting for this court challenge to be officially filed by Lisa Cook. We got confirmation from her attorney as such earlier today, and we're going to be watching closely if that does include this injunction, which would essentially reinstate Cook in her position for the time being while this case makes its way through the legal process. We should also just flag here that it is very likely that whoever wins or rather loses the injunction is going to file an appeal to that as well. So this is something to watch really closely on, because how the court ultimately weighs on that injunction could have pretty broad bearing impacts on what the makeup of the Fed board is going to look like come the September FOMC meeting. Joe, as you well know, I don't need to tell you, there is a very high legal bar here for the president to fire a Fed official. He's going to have to prove cause. The issue with cause is that it's not explicitly defined, though the president does say that he has sufficient evidence for cause. As you mentioned, these are just allegations at this point, and we have seen experts point to this idea that the Supreme Court has actually bolstered protections earlier this year when it comes to protecting Federal Reserve officials from being fired.
Joining us from a beautiful day on the North Lawn, Tyler Kendall, thank you so much for the update. We want to get a little bit more on this Lisa Cook matter. And Tyler mentions Anne-Marie Hordern actually was the one to ask President Trump about this during the cabinet meeting yesterday. Let's bring you back and listen.
The Fed just put out a statement saying that Lisa Cook has indicated through a personal attorney that she'll promptly challenge this action in court, seek a judicial decision that would confirm her ability to continue.
That's all right, whatever it
says
is.
the Fed will abide by any court decision.
Thank you very much for reading
abide
that.
by a court decision.
I abide by the court, yeah. I abide by.
He says he abides by the court, but as Tyler mentioned, there are still big questions about the way this is going to pan out. And we turn to Joel Griffith for insights on this, senior fellow at Advancing American Freedom. Joel, it's good to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. Will the president manage to fire Lisa Cook or not?
Well, I believe the odds are against the president in this situation. It's the Congress, when the Congress formed the Federal Reserve more than 100 years ago, made it very clear that Federal Reserve officials were to be secure in their appointments. And as was mentioned a second ago, they can only be fired with cause. And that is a very high legal bar. A mere accusation is not sufficient cause for a president to terminate that board appointment. This underscores a deeper problem here. We have a president who continues to try to cajole the Federal Reserve into enacting his preferred monetary policy. The way our central bank is structured, rightfully so, is that it operates independent of politics. We don't want a Federal Reserve that will be manipulating interest rates to satisfy the desires of any one particular politician. And we certainly don't want a Federal Reserve that is going to continually empower Congress to overspend. If we look at this situation, if the president is successful in terminating Ms. Cook, that's going to, of course, allow him to appoint someone to replace her. We've got another appointment coming up once Chair Powell leaves. I think we're in some dangerously uncharted waters here. I believe the court will decide in favor of Ms. Cook. Could be wrong on a prognostication, but from what I can see with past precedent, her case looks rock solid.
Well, okay. All of that said, maybe it's not about actually firing anybody. Joel, is that possible? The president doesn't care necessarily if Lisa Cook gets fired, but it puts a chill across the rest of the board, and it puts people in check when it comes to making decisions on interest rates. This is the concern about credibility when it comes to the Fed, right?
Well, that's correct, because the investigation that's been launched into her private real estate transactions, that investigation was launched by President Trump's own Department of Justice. And that's where this becomes doubly troubling. We just have an accusation at this point. There's been no charges filed. There's been no conviction. We have a president who we know wants to nudge the Fed or even force the Fed into lowering interest rates and into possibly monetizing more of the federal debt. If the president were to succeed on this in terminating her based on an accusation launched by his own Department of Justice, the precedent will now be set for future presidents to do the same, to launch investigations for future board members in order to give them an sensible reason to fire them. This is quite dangerous. We know what happens when a central bank becomes politicized. We saw this happen probably most recently with Turkey, where Erdogan was able to effectively commandeer control of the Turkish central bank. And the Turkish people now are seeing inflation rates of 20 and 30% a year. We don't want that to happen here. Our Fed needs to remain politically independent. The Senate, of course, has a vital role to play. The president has a vital role to play in nominating Fed board members, but once they're appointed, they need to have the ability to operate independent of the political winds of the day.
Yeah. Joel, we just laid on another 25% tariff on India, which brings it up to 50. This is the other big story we're talking about today. India, of course, was supposed to be a trading partner with warming relations, not cooling relations here with the U.S., but things seem to have fallen apart with attempts to make a deal. Now this extra 25% is effectively punishing India for buying Russian oil. Is it the smart thing to do?
No, levying more tariffs on India is not a smart thing to do, and it hurts an important ally. It also hurts our own families, our own businesses, and manufacturers here in the United States that are exporting. The tariffs that have been levied in India are in two parts. You've got the 25% so-called reciprocal tariff. Let's just dismantle that one for a second. The tariffs that India have been levying on our exports have been around a weighted average of 6%. If we were to impose a reciprocal tariff on India, that would mean a tariff on Indian imports of only 6%. So the reciprocal tariff that we're imposing on them is 4 times the rate that they're imposing on us. It makes no sense. Second of all, the additional 25% tariff that we're levying on them, supposedly because they're purchasing Russian products, that is only going to serve to drive India into closer economic relationships with our adversaries, Russia and also China. This is not a wise move. And the total cost on families of all the tariffs on India are approaching $400 a year annually per family. This is just another tax hike. We've seen a series of these tax hikes via tariffs. And sadly, the total combined impact now of the tariffs that have been imposed by President Trump for most families outweighs the benefits of the tax cuts that we just saw through the so-called one big beautiful bill.
All right, Joel, it's great to have you. Joel Griffith, Senior Fellow at Advancing American Freedom. We appreciate the insights as we keep our arms around the India tariff story and add the voice of Seema Sirohi, columnist for the Economic Times of India and author of the book Friends with Benefits, the India-U.S. story. Seema, welcome to Bloomberg. It's great to see you, and thanks for joining us here in studio today. Friends with Benefits is something that has been underway for decades. The warming of relations, economic ties between the U.S. and India. Does this 50% tariff undo all of that work?
To some extent, yes. The shock in India has been tremendous. It was not expected because trade talks were going quite well.
Yeah.
And the Commerce Secretary led us to believe that a deal would come through. But President Trump apparently decided not. India wasn't giving enough market access.
Okay.
And then there were a couple of other reasons. Russian oil being the latest problem. Now, if you remember, under the Biden administration, India was kind of encouraged to buy Russian oil so that the price of oil wouldn't go up too much, that Saudi oil and Iraqi oil would be available for the Europeans, because India is a very large buyer of oil.
Yes.
So now suddenly there's a turnaround. And as the Indian foreign minister said, India is quite perplexed at the turn of events. Some people think that President Trump has taken umbrage, and it's like a personal issue with him now, that India did not accept his role in the mediation between India and Pakistan during the 4-day war in May. So it's a whole lot of things that have come together to undo 25 years of really hard work.
Yeah, interesting. Knowing that Prime Minister Modi was the first foreign leader to visit this White House, things were said to be on the right track, to your point. But if this does cut off funding for what the president now refers to as Russia's war machine, is this additional 25% in fact worth it?
That's for the Americans to decide whether they want to pay higher price at the gas pump. But
if it means ending the killing in Ukraine, I guess is the other way of asking.
I'm not sure. Because President Putin has his own agenda vis-a-vis the United States. So it's not as if India stopping to buy oil is going to stop the war. He has, as we learned in Alaska, he wants certain things from Ukraine. He has continued with this war at great cost to his country, his people, and everything. You think he's going to give up because India stops buying oil? Besides, India has said it's going to buy oil from wherever it can get it, wherever the best deal is, because the government of India says it's the responsibilities to the 1.4 billion people of India. I think what's the tragedy is that Indian exporters who export items like gems and jewelry, leather products, they are going to hurt very badly because the U.S. is a very large market for them. And it's going to play out economically.
If I'm hearing you correctly, then instead of helping to end the war in Ukraine, make life more difficult for Russia, we are in fact pushing India further into the arms of Russia and China. Is that how you see it?
In a manner of speaking, yes.
Okay.
Because the relationship India had with the United States, it took years to build. And the whole idea, one of the underpinnings was that India, being a large Asian country, would be a counterbalance to China.
Yes.
And 3-4 administrations in Washington worked towards that. Now, suddenly he's appended that. So people in India are asking, what is President Trump's real game? Is he just cutting India out of everything? Is he wanting to make a deal with China so badly that he's ready to append an entire strategic partnership with India? Is he looking towards what many call the G2, which is a group of two in U.S. and China?
Is that how India sees this?
India is worried about it because even President Obama floated the idea. So Indians are very jittery about it. And yes, they are thinking about it. What is the end game? Is it to divide the world between the US, China, and Russia if he makes a deal with Putin as well on the side? And then India gets left out.
So how do you have both, though? If this helps us reach a deal with China, and we're also pushing India into the arms of China, how do you have both?
China is the only country that gains net in this situation.
Sounds like it under this construct.
Absolutely. Because China is already, on the ascendant. It wants to displace the United States as the number one power. And it has leverage over the U.S. India does not. So when President Trump put tariffs on China, they stopped critical minerals, and the president backed off. So they have leverage. So they are in a situation where India is trying to reach an accommodation with China. The U.S. is trying to reach an accommodation with China. So Xi Jinping has every reason to be extremely happy.
We have less than a minute left. How would you describe, in a couple of words, President Trump's relationship with Prime Minister Modi?
I would have said that they were good friends, that there was some sort of, friendship between them. I no longer think so. Besides, I hesitate to attribute personal relations to relations between countries, because leaders at the end of the day are looking after their own national interests.
That's right. Although this is a president that seems to pivot entirely on relationships. Seema, it's great to have you with us. Seema Sirohi, live in Washington with us here on Bloomberg. We appreciate the insights. We're going to turn the conversation back to Lisa Cook and the president's attempt to fire the Federal Reserve governor. We'll get into India tariffs as well when we spend time coming up with Joe Lavorgna. Just arrived here in our studios in Washington. Straight ahead on Bloomberg as we watch Nvidia specifically today leading up to earnings after the bell. But of course, the broader tech space could be impacted by the news for better or worse. And that's why the building will shake a little after 4 o'clock when Nvidia results go out. We're also tracking the story surrounding Lisa Cook with reporting today that the Fed governor's lawyer could file a lawsuit against the administration after President Trump moved to have her fired. This is just one of the stories that we're going to be talking about with Joe Lavorgna. Told you he was coming in. Counselor to the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, former economic advisor to President Trump in the first administration, just walked over on a beautiful day in Washington. It doesn't get any nicer than this. Thanks for coming by. It's always a pleasure to see you. This is pretty interesting, the moment that we're in here involving Lisa Cook, because there are a lot of questions about process. This is going to go to court apparently now. What about due process? Why are we moving to fire someone who's not been charged with anything?
If you look at the Federal Reserve Act, it does say for cause, right. And it looks like those forms were not filled out accurately, that they were filled out improperly. And this is why Secretary Bessent highlighted why he believes the Fed should do an internal probe. The law may not be clear where it dots everything out, where there has to be a specific process. It says for cause. The president believes he has cause. Certainly, we have to take these things very seriously, given the fact the Fed is a regulator, and we'll see where it goes.
Don't you want to know if he has cause, though? I mean, is it up to the president to say that something was wrong?
Yes, I do.
Here?
I think so, Joe. And as Secretary Bessent alluded to, Governor Cook has not said she didn't do it, and that's maybe perhaps is quite important. The Fed, look, we need trust in government, and the president came in. He wanted to make things more efficient, streamline, get rid of the bloated bureaucracy. We're seeing that. We're seeing government spending slow pretty significantly. We've seen a lot of excess federal jobs go by the wayside. He actually wants to bring trust back to institutions. We've had other episodes in the past where Fed governors have had to resign because of alleged improprieties. And this one certainly could be quite serious, and it's the president's prerogative, and I believe he has the ability, because, again, it's for cause, and it looks like these things are pretty serious, to basically do what he's doing.
The administration willing to go to the Supreme Court on this?
Well, we'll see what happens. We have to see how the law plays itself out and going through that process. I don't know. I'm not being a lawyer, not knowing how it's going to work, but the president certainly, I think, has a good reason to be concerned about what's happened. And this notion somehow about Fed independence, remember, whoever is ultimately confirmed for the Fed chair, for Adriana Kugler's position, and possibly Ms. Cook's position, has to go through Senate approval. So this notion somehow that there's a hit to Fed independence is a bit misleading and out of context, because whoever is chosen will have to be vetted properly.
And I guess Stephen Myron will have a confirmation hearing next week. Is that what you expect?
It's supposed to be moved up, so fingers crossed. Hopefully that happens soon.
Did that conversation just get a little more difficult for him? Democrats are going to come out swinging on this, aren't they?
Well, the problem is the Democrats have not supported any of the president's picks to begin with, so I'm not sure that really matters.
So it's the same prep if you're Stephen Myron.
I would think so, yeah. He's got a very good record, and he was already confirmed just back in March.
Right.
So it's like, what's changed? So I would hope that goes through smoothly and that Stephen gets it. He'd be a great governor.
Bloomberg News reporting late yesterday, Bloomberg Scoop, that the president wants to go further and actually start to affect the makeup of the 12 regional banks. Is that the next layer here? Because that will bring up a whole other conversation about independence.
Possibly. I mean, the thing is,
does he want to reshape the Fed to his own likeness?
I think the Fed needs to be. I mean, the Fed probably needs some serious overhaul and reshaping. I mean, the fact that the governors have basically agreed to every president, I think, in the history with which they've been, actually the ability to not have a president get that position just shows the fact that everything has been rubber stamped. And the presidents aren't really going through a democratic process in that sense, right? It's a private, sort of quasi-private entity elects these people to the reserve banks, and then the Board of Governors then kind of approves it. I like what the president's trying to do. He's trying to have a very populist, very, everyday American, everyman approach, so to speak, to policy making, where he wants to lift up Main Street. And the Fed oftentimes is perceived to be, a globalist, elitist institution. That's a perception that the institution has. And I think even the Fed itself would probably admit that there's been some overreach. And Secretary Bessent has said that, and they want the Fed to go back to kind of its core mission of low and stable inflation, full employment, and moderate and low interest rates.
We're going to get interest rate cut or cuts starting in September, according at least to market expectations. There's a worry, though, that if the president puts a chill across the Fed, that the Board of Governors may not always be acting on data, that it may be influenced by the president. Why do you doubt that?
Well, a couple of reasons, Joe. One is you had two governors dissent, and they dissented before we had that employment report, which showed massive downward revision. So there were very strong cases to be made why rates should be lower before that meeting. And then, of course, those Governors Bowman and Waller, certainly their case, I think, is more strong. The chair himself has said, look, interest rates are high relative to the neutral rate, they're high even relative to the highest dot on the dot plot. So the Fed has put itself in a position where it needs to be accountable for its forecasts and for what it's saying. Factually, their inflation forecasts have gone up from March to June as inflation dipped slightly lower, so their forecast error got wider. The bond market is telling you that there's not an inflation problem. Break-even inflation is well contained. The 10-year note is well contained. So there's nothing in the markets who are forward-looking that's worried at all about Fed independence. I think the president and Secretary Bessent has been echoing this, really want to bring accountability, get rid of the mission creep, and reevaluate, sort of get back to the basics of what the Fed is supposed to do. I don't look at that as being at all an attack on independence, but rather, okay, let's fix this situation, which had gotten a bit broken over the past dozen and a half years.
You mentioned inflation. There are still questions about when this is going to start showing up in consumer data. The market did get a bit spooked by the PPI, suggesting that, maybe it's actually finally here. This is the threshold before it spills over on the retail side. Is that going to happen? And if not, who's eating this?
So, the PPI was a bit higher than expected. That was after 5 months of very weak readings. Some of that was in things like retail services, which actually are margins from company to company. The CPI has not shown that inflation. Goods prices since the president took office are down 0.4% annualized. Since April, when all the tariff actually accelerated, inflation is still barely positive. So I don't think, Joe, we're seeing any of the tariff effect yet. Maybe it shows up at some point, but I'd argue, given the fact that we're debating whether there is a tariff effect, is proof positive that clearly it was not anywhere near as bad as all the experts and pundits thought. The president said that we've got the leverage, that our trading partners are largely going to eat those tariffs, and I think that's exactly what's happened.
Before you leave, I have to ask you about Nvidia, because it's Nvidia Day. We've got the earnings coming, and your boss was talking about it earlier today, knowing that the government is taking a 10% stake in Intel. Should we have a stake in the world's most valuable chip maker, Nvidia? Scott Bessent was asked about it on Fox earlier. Listen.
I don't think Nvidia needs financial support. That seems not on the table right now. I don't know if we need to take stakes in defense companies. We'll see whether the defense companies are fulfilling their mission in terms of providing adequate and timely deliveries for the U.S. military.
How does in our remaining moment, the conservative Republican inside of you feel about government stakes in publicly traded companies?
The Intel is a unique situation because the Science and Chips Act under the prior administration gave significant amounts of money.
So you feel like we bought that stake already?
Yeah, that stake, and that's why. So I look at Intel as being a very unique case.
What about a Lockheed or something else?
Well, the secretary has said, look, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
He's not made any type of commitment to do that. I think people are conflating Intel or you thinking that's going to be a blueprint for other places. And I think in this case, Intel is unique because of the grants they were getting, and the administration properly thought that, look, the taxpayer could benefit much more with the upside of actually converted to a non-voting equity stake.
Fascinating. It's always great to spend time with you, Joe. Enjoy the walk back to the Treasury Department. It's only a couple blocks from here. Joe Lavorgna, counselor to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. We'll keep our arms around the Nvidia story right now. And what a pleasure to have Caroline Hyde with us, of course, the host of Bloomberg Tech, live on Bloomberg TV and radio, a little later than usual. Caroline, what are we in for after 4 o'clock? And is it enough to meet expectations as opposed to beat and raise?
Joe, the pleasure's all mine. And, well, there has been a lot of optimism going into these numbers. This is a company that has the most valuable company in the world. It is $4.4 trillion. It is 1% off a record high. And the expectations are for at least 50% increase in revenue. And we're seeing more than 50% increase in earnings per share, too. The question, though, is more about its forecast. And will that live up to the hype? And more broadly, the confusion. Because here are a load of analysts. I would say there's only one sell recommendation on this stock, more than 70 buys. But among all of those analysts, there is a $15 billion discrepancy between the highest expectations for the forecast and revenue and the lowest. And why is that so broad? Because people don't know whether Jensen is going to be factoring in Chinese revenue into the next fiscal quarter, into their fiscal third quarter. And so that is where the discrepancy lies. And that comes at the very heart of what you talk about day in, day out, Joe, which is geopolitics.
God knows. And we're going to be listening for news on China. I'm looking at the stock, Caroline. It's not moving a lot today. It's just up fractionally, but just below its all-time high. This thing is looking pretty rich going into earnings. How will the technicals factor into the reaction?
Well, what's interesting is, yes, it's a record high, but because revenues have grown so much. Last year, they were growing at more than 200% per quarter. Now they've slowed down to only just 50%. But because revenue has been scaling so fast, because earnings have been scaling so fast, Joe, actually, on a PE ratio, this thing looks pretty appetizing. I mean, it's nowhere near the 190 times forward profit that we see on a Palantir. Instead, it's trading at about 30 times. So actually, from an expense perspective, not all that much, but there is so many high hopes. They are going to have to beat expectations because we've already factored in a meet.
I love the fact that we're just calling him Jensen now.
Yeah,
first name basis with the world. Right. Caroline, thank you so much. The great Caroline Hyde, live from world headquarters in New York. This is going to be obviously an enormous topic on Bloomberg Tech on the next program here. It'll happen after 4 o'clock. The conference call will take place by the time we take air at 5 p.m. on the late edition of Balance of Power. We should have a pretty good idea of where things stand. And Romaine Bostick will have more for us on that later this evening. Straight ahead on Balance of Power, you do want to stay with us. We'll spend some time with the Colonel. Colonel Sanders is coming in from Bloomberg Intelligence to talk about this idea of potentially taking a stake in defense contractors. We'll also turn to Gaza and Israel in our conversation with Hagar Chemali. It's all ahead on Bloomberg. Here on Balance of Power. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. As we carry on here on Bloomberg TV and radio, one of the issues we just discussed with Joe Lavorgna was the idea of a potential government stake in one or more of our defense contractors. Of course, remembering that government's taking a 10% stake in Intel. Scott Bessent this morning on Fox Business ruled out the idea of a stake in Nvidia. But just a day earlier, Howard Lutnick had floated the prospect of this happening with other companies, say maybe a Lockheed Martin. That's all you have to do is say that on TV, and all of a sudden the stocks start to move. And we did see a little bit of a rally in shares of the big defense contractors yesterday. Joe Lavorgna seemed to just now pour cold water on this idea, suggesting that Nvidia is a story of its own and should not be considered the same as a defense contractor or even Nvidia. They certainly aren't the same, and it's something we wanted to talk about with an expert. Wayne Sanders, Colonel Sanders, is with us. Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Defense Research Analyst. Yes, retired Army Colonel. Great to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you
as
much.
always.
Thanks for having me.
Lockheed Martin would like this idea or not?
Well, I think Lockheed would like it.
It would?
I don't think that Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, some of the other primes.
What would it mean for competition, I guess, is the question.
I mean, you're looking at that point in time, you're not looking at a fair shake when you're coming through. A lot of conflict of interest discussions normally come into this from the federal acquisition regulations that normally put in that so that you don't have these kind of conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
Even the undersecretaries themselves normally have to sign something if they have connections to a specific company and then have to deal with those. So they have to actually be removed from it. And now you're saying, I'm going to give somebody a potential stake into it. And then saying, okay, yeah, well, now how do I ensure that it's been fair when it was fairly competed? And then if you award that contract to that company that you have a government stake in, what happens if it's not going well and you want to be able to pull out of that contract?
Yes.
Look at the future aviation, future attack reconnaissance aircraft. The Army was able to pull out of that because of the stipulations that are in place.
I see.
But would they do that if they had a 10% company in the company, or 10% in the company?
Then you have weapons programs to nowhere and money that's difficult to justify. How's this different than MP materials, for instance, which the government took a stake in to try to harvest more rare earths? This is clearly a national security interest.
Absolutely. I think that when you look at MP Minerals, the way that this is done, it's done from an industry perspective. MP Minerals is the only one that can actually do a lot of the rare earths mining that is already active to be able to meet some national security needs that are there. And they created the floor in order to make it sure that China couldn't come in and undercut. So from that perspective, that was addressing something that there wasn't enough competition in. It was a part of the defense industrial base that needed support. When you throw it at a specific company versus an industry, if you look at shipbuilding, another one. Shipbuilding is another one that needs that help, and you see maritime prosperity zones being put out in executive orders, different things that are incentivizing people to come in and compete within that environment.
Interesting.
But you're not giving the money directly to one specific company and giving them an edge up.
You know, we've talked a lot about the DIB, the defense industrial base, and the need for some very not high-tech things like just shells. Never mind the missiles that are used to intercept missiles from Russia, the Patriot missiles and so forth, but the old-fashioned stuff, bullets even. If these companies aren't incentivized to make them, would nationalizing part of these programs help?
It could. It's one of the ones that I thought munitions, I thought shipbuilding. Those are some of those areas that are in there.
Perfect. Yeah.
But you look at the way it's government-owned, contract operated, is the way that a lot of the Army depots and the plants actually create these munitions, right? So you look at like General Dynamics. Ordnance, OTS, as they're known. They partner with the government in order to be able to do that, but it's owned through that process. You look at propellants and accelerants, some of those are classified capabilities to mix the right things for energetics to be able to go out. So that partnership does become key, but they just have to make sure that they're doing it in a fair way.
You're so good at this. Thank you for shedding some light. Wayne Sanders, Bloomberg Intelligence Colonel, thank you, as always, for being with us here on Balance of Power. I thought we'd learn something there along the way. We'll keep tabs on this story if it's going anywhere, and we may not talk about it again. It's hard to tell if that was something that Howard Lutnick even planned to say on TV yesterday. Turning to the situation that's underway in Gaza right now, and some pretty fascinating reporting that the president is planning to lead a large meeting. This is coming from Fox News earlier, a conversation with Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, set to lead a large meeting on a day-after plan for Gaza once the conflict ends. This is the first time that we've even heard a reference to such a plan existing, and we wanted to talk about it with Hagar Chemali. It's a story that we need to spend a little bit of time on here. Former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council, founder, CEO, Greenwich Media Strategies. Hagar, it's great to see you. I want to ask you about a lot of things that are happening on the ground in Gaza and in Israel, but with regard to this day after plan, what will it include, and why haven't we heard about it until now?
Yeah, you know, by the way, Joe, it's not uncommon for the U.S. government to plan day after plans when you have a war. When I handled the first 2 years of the Syria crisis at the NSC, when things become, especially when things become very tenuous and you feel like there's no way ahead, often the government pivots to day after planning. And there could be a million reasons for that. Some of it could just be churn. Some of it could be a make work exercise. Some of it is because when you envision the day after, it can help walk you backwards and say like, well, okay, if that's what we want the day after, then we have to set things up accordingly. We have to find these allies. We have to get this investment. We have to set up this security arrangement. I mean, whatever it might be. So, but in my experience, I find that often when the U.S. government focuses on the day after, it's because they're struggling with the present, and especially in a war. And I experienced it myself with Syria. It was churn, hours of day after planning that never ended up materializing. I will say this war is different, though, because there is a feeling, and I get this from a lot of my Israeli friends and Israeli sources, many of whom are close to the government. And there's a general feeling that regardless of how difficult things are right now, there's a sentiment that it's going to end soon, hopefully by the end of the year, within a few months. So there is at least an opportunity with the day after in this one.
Interesting. It's noteworthy, I think, for some people because the extent to which the president has talked about leveling Gaza, not that there's much left, removing everyone who lives there and building condos, making it a waterfront resort area. Is that going to be in the day after plan?
I highly doubt it. I don't think I don't expect a Mara Gaza. I think it would take a significant amount of investment to get there. Unless it's private investment, I just don't see it happening. I think it's this anytime, again, you're doing day after, you're thinking about who's going to pick up the trash the next day. If Hamas is not governing, which is we've all seen, and the U.S. agrees with this, Israel is certainly pushing for this. it is not an option to have Hamas govern. So if Hamas is not governing, who is governing that would have the legitimacy and support from the people? How are you going to have functioning schools, water, hospitals, all that stuff? And what is the role of the United States in that, especially when you have an administration that is never looking to fund these operations themselves, right? Where they rather look toward other countries or mechanisms or private investment to make something like that happen. So if they say, for example, the goal is the long-term stability of Israel and not to have Hamas govern Gaza, then how can we, the United States, since the Israeli government, by the way, is not doing this kind of planning at all, and that is, many of my Israeli friends tell me that, if they're not doing this kind of planning, then the U.S. can at least try and help do that so that they can figure out the policies from now.
Yeah, incredible images that we're looking at right now on Bloomberg TV of Gaza, much of which looks like the surface of the moon. Hagar, I want to ask you about the outrage surrounding these attacks. There were a double strike, if you will, by Israel against Gaza, killed 20 people at a hospital there, including multiple journalists. The Israeli military now says it was going after a Hamas surveillance camera and that 6 of those killed were members of Hamas. But there are a lot of accusations out there that this was intentional. How do you see it?
Well, I don't see it as intentional for a few reasons. The reason, let's walk a bit back for a second about this hospital. Nasser Hospital, which is under permanent evacuation orders, meaning nobody should be there, was taken over by the Qassam Brigades, which is the military wing of Hamas. And they used this hospital to operate out of it. And this is well documented already. We know that Hamas took hostages and kept them there, for example. And it's now been months that it's it's under permanent evacuation orders. We also do know that the Israeli government says that they were targeting a Hamas outpost and CCTV camera that was placed on the corner of the roof of this hospital. Yeah. And the video shows that the first strike, and as you mentioned, there were 2, that the first shell struck the corner of that roof. So I'm inclined to believe that, also because it is known that Hamas looks and monitors IDF movements from the rooftop of that hospital. So this is already established. Why the second shell happened, and it happened 7 minutes later after the first, when you had civilians and a handful of reporters, as you said, go up the side staircase, and why you had that second shell that ended up striking them and killing, as you said, I think 20, is still we don't know yet. The investigation is still happening. The reason I'm inclined to believe that it wasn't deliberately targeted is because you saw the IDF and the prime minister come out very quickly to say that they deeply regret that there were non-combatants included and so on. And they don't do that often. They do that historically, and you see it over and over again when a mistake happens. When a mistake happens, that's what's said. Now, I'm not trying to justify this attack altogether. Unfortunately, it is emblematic of what happens when you have a collapse of ceasefire talks and you have the Israeli government that said they intend to expand the war in Gaza, as they decided 2 weeks ago. That operation to fully expand into Gaza actually hasn't really started. It starts in 2 to 3 weeks. And so this is a very tenuous moment, and it's also why that Trump meeting is so important. But it doesn't serve the Israeli government's interest right now. That's another reason I don't think it was likely targeted, because this is a government that's currently facing a significant amount of pressure because of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza from the hostage families as well. So the last thing they're going to want is Trump to shift his position and say that he's not happy about it, which he said that publicly, and to then pressure Netanyahu to reach an end to the war, which is what Trump said he would do. That he said he doesn't think a temporary ceasefire is possible, but he wants to push him toward a permanent end. So that's why I don't think this was deliberately targeted. It is an unfortunate and tragic and awful situation that has come out of where we are now. And, hopefully the administration can push towards a temporary ceasefire. But Trump himself said he doesn't think that's possible, and that they're trying to push toward a permanent end instead, which would take some time.
Well, the ranking member, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, is now calling for certain weapons to be withheld from Israel as leverage to affect outcomes here, leverage over Benjamin Netanyahu. This is a debate that we were having toward the end of the Biden administration. Hagar, we talked about it at the time. Ro Khanna, the congressman from California, calls this the defining issue for the Democratic Party. In our remaining moment, what's going to happen here?
Yeah, I don't see that happening. First of all, the senators of the Armed Services Committee, the Armed Services on the Senate side, they're not saying this.
Yeah.
The fact is that it's a minority of congressional members, both in the House and the Senate, that believe in withholding aid to Israel in terms of to affect an outcome. And at the end of the day, you have an administration that has stated over and over again that they will never put Israel in a position where it feels less secure, or that they push them toward a policy that makes them feel less secure. It's difficult. What I will say is that, so I don't see that policy playing out whatsoever. And frankly, I think that the Democrats have much bigger problems on their hands that they need to focus on. A huge chasm in their own party played out, as we can see, being played out in New York City right now. And so,
well, that's the truth, Hagar. I wish we had more time, but we have to end our conversation there. From Greenwich Media Strategies, Hagar Chemali, we always appreciate the insights. I'll meet you back here in a couple of hours, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the late edition of Balance of Power, only here on Bloomberg TV and radio.